Hey everyone, welcome to 10 Seconds to Air. I'm your host, Alita Guillen. Are you living according to your values? While most of us would say yes, many of us are not being honest. How many times do we comply with a doctor who wants to run tests when we know we don't need it? Or we agree with a coworker or boss when we know better? Why do we do that? And how can we say no in a world that demands yes? My guest today is Dr. Sunita Sah, a renowned organizational psychologist and professor at Cornell University. She says there are many factors that influence the choices we make. She also says society puts an incredible amount of pressure on us to comply. She joins me now to explain why we say yes when our values are more in line with no, and how we can start making decisions that align with our values right now.
Stand by. We're going live. Going live. 10, 9, going live. 7, 6, 5, going live. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Dr. Sah, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The first rule for today is do not comply. If I ask you a question, don't comply if you don't want to answer it.
I'll answer a different question.
You'll answer a different question. Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to getting into this because I know I am guilty of saying yes when I probably mean no. And then later on, I go, why did I say that? So many of us continue to do that. And you have the answer as to why, and you're going to get us out of it, right?
I'm going to try, definitely.
So what goes through your mind 10 seconds before you speak on this topic, meet with students, or perform in some way?
So I always talk about the power of the pause, especially if you need that just before you're deciding whether or not to defy. So that sort of 10 seconds, the power of the pause, I think is extremely useful in many different situations where you just catch your breath and decide how to react. Rather than it being an emotional response, a knee-jerk response, you can ask yourself something about the situation. So if it's in a situation where you want to defy, you could ask yourself, is this safe? Is this effective? Or the first question I always recommend is, does this go against my values? Because that's when you that's when you know that you have to defy.
That takes so much control.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And that's why I always say defiance is a practice. It's a skill that we need to learn and practice over and over again.
Yeah. Have you always been someone to question this, or did this come up because you saw this happening and you said, hey, wait a second, why? How did this originate for you?
For me, I grew up with what I would call a masterclass in compliance. So as a child, I was known for being an obedient daughter and student. And my name, Sunita, actually in Sanskrit means good. And mostly I lived up to that. So I did what I was told. I complied. I got up when I was told to, went to school on time, even had my hair cut the way my parents wanted me to. So these were the messages that I received, not just from parents, but from teachers and the community. And it was to be good. And to be good often meant to obey, to be polite, to fit in, to do as you're told, don't question authority. And so we start equating compliance with being good and defiance with being bad. And then in my research, actually, my first career was in medicine, mainly because of expectations. I went to medical school and then I qualified and worked as a physician because, again, that was the expectation. But I did take time out during my medical degree to do an integrated degree in psychology. And it was there I got introduced to some infamous work on authority to obedience and why people comply. And I was fascinated by it. Just like, as a child, even though I was so compliant, I was always fascinated by people who could defy and how they could do it so much easier. They knew how to be themselves. They knew how to speak up. And I really wanted to look at that in more depth. And when I did, I discovered that there's some real problems with being so compliant. And that's when I started to discover that we actually need defiance and we've misunderstood what it means to defy.
Yeah. Why is it that we comply so much? Because I agree, when you're a kid, you want to comply, right? You know that will please your parents. And when you're in a job, you comply, will please your boss.
Exactly.
Why are we doing that?
So we become so socialized to comply, it almost becomes a default response. So our brains become wired to comply. We get some short-term rewards from that. And then when we get older, it becomes really hard to defy. It feels very unnatural. And so we actively resist defiance. And there's three key reasons for why this happens. So the first one is that we feel this enormous pressure to go along with what other people want. And I've really delved into that aspect, this social pressure, in my research and uncovered a psychological process that I'm happy to talk about. But that's the first one. The second one was we don't really understand what compliance and defiance and consent really are. So we've misunderstood all of those terms. And then the third one is once we decide to defy, we don't actually know how. We don't have the skill set to do it because we've been trained so much in compliance. We don't actually know how to defy, what things to say, how to put it into action. So because of those three reasons, we end up complying when we don't want to. So yes, that's not really a yes.
Go to the first one. And why is that happening? Like, let's dive into these.
Yeah, absolutely. So the very first one, this social pressure to go along with other people. And it happens a lot. So you can imagine that your boss asks you to do something and you think it's the wrong way to go,
Yeah.
or that they even ask you to take a shortcut and you don't think that's the right thing to do, and yet everybody else is doing it, then it becomes very difficult to say no. Because if you say no, it implies that they're either incompetent or unethical, or it implies something negative about them. So my terminology for this is insinuation anxiety. It's a distinct type of anxiety that arises when we worry that our non-compliance with another person's wishes is going to be interpreted as a signal of distrust. So it insinuates that the person is not whom they appear to be or should be. So let me describe some other situations that this can happen. It can happen in very small stakes situations, such as you're at the hairdresser and they're saying, okay, you should really try this new cut. You trust me. And they're cutting away and you're thinking, oh no, I'm not sure. And you don't say anything and they finish, you hate it. And then they say, isn't it great? And you're like, yes, thank you. And if you're anything like me, you'll probably tip them and walk out.
That is a great example.
So it could be very small stakes like that, or it could be even more serious problems. So when I looked into the research, I found that one survey discovered 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, did not feel comfortable to speak up when they saw a colleague or a physician making an error.
Oh, wow.
Now, that is a situation we really need people to be speaking up. And it's also why co-pilots might not speak up to their pilots. In another study, about 50% of crew members on commercial airlines felt uncomfortable to say anything when they saw a mistake. So again, another life and death situation. And let me describe one more, since I'm a professor. There was a young female professor that was asked to be on a committee for assessing grants. And so they were reviewing grant applications and deciding who would receive a grant and who wouldn't. And she was on this committee with 4 senior men. And when it came to one particular applicant, and that applicant was a Black man, she said that the conversation changed and it went more to gossip rather than looking at the quality of the application or the credentials. And she really wanted to say something, but she didn't. And when she came out, she said the one thing that she wanted to do was the thing that she couldn't do. And that was to really say something and challenge the fact and ask them questions as to, should we go to the credentials?
Right.
Or she just said like she couldn't, because it would imply something negative about the integrity of the other people on the committee.
So I have a question about that, because what you're saying is if she spoke up, it would imply something negative about the committee. Or, for example, the hairdresser, if you spoke up, you're saying that means I don't trust you. I sort of think, and you're the expert on this, I also feel if I were to speak up, that would maybe make people think differently of me, right? So That's the other
Right.
side of it.
So that's also a possibility, is that people will think you're being difficult, you're
Right.
disrupting the harmony. And that's all part of the same thing of insinuation anxiety, because we have two selves. We have this ideal independent self where we want to do what we like. We want to express our agency and do whatever we want. And then we have this other interdependent self where we're really concerned about harmony with the other person, and we want to be part of a group and society and get on with everyone else. And these two ideal selves, there's always a little bit of tension, and you can never reach one ideal or the other, and you probably don't want to.
Right.
Where insinuation anxiety comes into play is that you do become very, very concerned about the harmony aspect, but more so about offending the other person and implying something negative about the other person.
Right.
I mean, certainly we feel with defiance, people worry about defying because they worry about negative consequences to themselves, which could be a negative judgment on themselves. But insinuation anxiety, the actual scientific term, is sort of the negative signal going to the other person.
Okay.
We want to save their face. We don't want to bring them down in the eyes of other, even nurses say, if they see the physician doing something in front of the patient, it's even more difficult.
Right.
And so you do this to save the integrity of the other person, the face of the other person. But what's really interesting about it is that you actually diminish some of your own integrity in order to do that.
Yes.
And so this becomes really quite a powerful force that keeps many of us silent and compliant.
Yes.
And I found it in a range of different situations, in medical situations where people have told me that they've been to the dentist and dentist has recommended all these different treatments, and they want to say no, but they find it very difficult to say no. When they're in the back of a taxi cab and it's going the really long route, and they want to say something, but they can't. So many situations and stories I've heard of people succumbing to insinuation anxiety and not being able to speak up and say how they really feel.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it happen more for men versus women, women versus men?
So in most of my studies, I found no gender effect, apart from one where I found a really high gender effect. And that was in a study, I can call it the ferry study, where we had a middle-aged white man approach passengers on a ferry going from Connecticut to Long Island and ask them to take part in a survey for $5 in cash. Now, the survey was really short with innocuous questions such as, is the ferry running on time? Is ferry clean? I wasn't interested in those answers. But once that survey was finished, the man would say to people, well, I can give you the $5 as promised, or I can enter you into this mystery lottery that pays out on average less than $5. So you can imagine what most people chose. So most people, 92% chose the $5 cash. So that is the preferred response of most passengers. But when the man recommended, I think you should go for the lottery, 20% said, okay. So it went up from 8% to 20%. Even more alarming was another condition where the man would reveal an ulterior motive, like a conflict of interest. So if he recommended the lottery again and then said, but I should let you know that I'm incentivized to recommend the lottery because I also receive a commission if you take the lottery.
Right.
Then compliance with this bad advice, you could call it, goes up to 42%.
Whoa.
Yes.
Why is that happening? Why are we doing that?
So what I found was, what was really surprising is trust in the advice went down. The people didn't like the man anymore, but it was the measure of insinuation anxiety. How uncomfortable are you to reject the advice? Because I'm uncomfortable to reject it because it implies that the man could be biased, or it signals I don't trust him. And that effect was purely driven by women. Men didn't succumb to that in this condition, but this was women did not want to signal they didn't trust the man's advice.
Wow.
So that was really quite surprising. In other studies I've done, I found even higher levels of compliance, which really is quite astounding when we think about we're a country that really prides ourselves on our independence and agency and free thinking, that even when you make the advice really obviously bad, that people will still take it.
Yeah.
So yes, in that condition, we did find a gender effect. So in some situations, certain groups of people are more affected than other groups of people, and we should be aware of that.
Well, women, you just
women
said,
in
yes.
that situation, yes, for sure.
So I have a question about medical advice. You're a doctor. You had patients. I think this happens a lot. When you go into the doctor, you have this, as a patient, you have this idea that they know better, and you just kind of let things happen. You refer to this in your book about a test that you took, and you knew you didn't want to take the test. You knew you didn't need the test. I feel that happens very often, and we just simply don't say anything. It happened to you. Is that because we're afraid to tell the doctor, like, are we feeling like I'm questioning you?
Exactly.
I mean, it's such a shame.
So the power dynamics are there, right? And that level of insinuation anxiety is even stronger in this situation because the doctor has expertise. And they are supposed to put your best interests at heart. They have, do no harm, So in that case, it becomes even more difficult when you're in a situation where there's high expectations for integrity and benevolence and competence. Then it becomes very difficult to say you don't trust the other side. And most of the time, it's not an element of distrust, right? If you're going to see a doctor, you might know certain things better about your body than the doctor does. But even though I've heard so many stories of, the doctor's always in a rush and not really taking the time. And there's different ways to approach advice in medicine. Like, some people really want the paternalistic type advice. Just tell me what to do. I'm going to follow it. And we do have high trust in our doctors, and it would be a shame if we didn't, if that was completely lost. But there are times when less is more in medicine, and there can also be an aspect of overdiagnosis and overtreatment that's been well documented in the medical literature. And because I was aware of that, and also the differences between how medicine is practiced in the UK and the US, and because I'd worked in respiratory medicine, or pulmonary medicine, you call it here, when they asked for something to test to see if I had a blood clot in the lungs, I knew I wasn't suffering from that kind of pain. I knew it had a distinct kind of pain. So I did have the knowledge and understanding there, but you're right. Even though I had that knowledge and understanding, it was so difficult for me to say no and become the difficult patient and insinuate that they don't know what they're doing, or they're giving me bad advice, because you're in that type of situation where you're very vulnerable. And it's the biggest context for having informed consent. This is where informed consent should be at its ideal. And yet, even then, in those situations, it's very difficult.
Is it possible that as a patient, you've been on the other side of this, so help us on that side of it. Is it possible that the patient is not giving enough information? Or I often see maybe a patient comes in and just wants help, just doesn't give you all the clues. And therefore, maybe it goes to number 2 that you were talking about being misunderstood, or that there's just not enough information to make a good decision, and therefore we end up down this kind of rabbit hole of one, compliant moment after another that maybe we didn't intend to. It wasn't the way we meant it to be, but it just kept going in that direction because of lack of information or being misunderstood.
As a patient, you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say in general, not just patients, but in many different situations, that once we start complying with something, it becomes harder to then start to say no. A lot of defiance comes early on. And so if we do start complying, we really have to make that extra effort. And again, it could be because we don't understand what compliance and defiance and consent are. So I can tell you, compliance and consent are often conflated with each other. They're assumed to be the same thing, but they're actually fundamentally different.
Okay, so slow down just one second. So compliance and consent. I'm just wrapping my head around that. Not the same thing.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No.
Okay, go ahead and define that now. Compliance and consent.
So compliance is something that's externally imposed. It's something that we slide into. It could be an automatic yes or something we do reluctantly. So we go along with it, and it's usually due to some kind of external pressure. So a suggestion, advice, or even societal expectations. We comply with those things. Consent is fundamentally different. And what I do and lay out in the book is informed consent in medicine. I take the definition of that and I apply it to other important decisions we make in our lives. And I think this is a really useful exercise that we can do when we're thinking about consent. So for true consent, we need 5 elements.
Okay.
So first of all, we need capacity. So that's the mental capacity. So we don't want to be too sick, under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And physicians are always supposed to examine patients to make sure they have the capacity to make an informed decision. So capacity is the first one. The next one is knowledge. So you need information about the decision you're about to make. But it's not just being given the information. The third element is actually thoroughly understanding that information. So you need a good grasp of all the facts, the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. So that's capacity, knowledge, understanding. The fourth one is the freedom to say no. Because if you don't have the freedom to say no, then it's merely compliance. It's not consent. So you need to be able to say no. And if all 4 of those elements are there, then the 5th element is your authorization, your deeply considered authorization of yes, if it's your consent or what I call your true yes, or no, if it's your dissent or your true no or defiance.
Mm-hmm. This all sounds great. The question that comes to my mind is, do we all know what we really want? What our values really are? It seems to me that it's really easy to slide into a lot of things, comply. You're a kid, you talk about being a kid, being agreeable and complying, and so maybe we don't know what we really want, and so compliance is kind of easy.
Can sometimes be easier, but there are actually large costs of compliance if we go against our values. And that comes back to what is it that we really want?
Yeah.
So the very first step in my Defiance Compass is to ask ourselves, who am I? And that's a really important question because we don't often think about what our values are unless you're in one of my classes. And I have my executive students do this all the time. Like, what are your values? Like, think about your values and write down and explain why your values are really important, because that makes you who you are. And the reason I ask them to write it down and explain is because the research shows that your intended behaviors are more likely to follow if you actually write down your values. And clarifying our values actually leads to a lower biological stress reaction. So we have lower cortisol levels if we know who we are. And it's really important for a number of reasons, because another exercise I do with my executive students is that I ask them, one of the values that I see year after year after year with this exercise is integrity. So we very much value integrity. Like we don't want to be called untrustworthy or anything along those lines, or dishonest. So when I ask my students, before we do the values exercise, to rate yourself on your level of honesty on a scale of 0 to 100 relative to other people in the room, where if you think you're the least honest in the room, you would be 0. And if you think you're the most honest in the room, you would be 100. And if you're about average, it would be 50.
Oh, I can't wait to hear how this turns out.
Yeah. Can you guess how it turns out?
No, are people saying they're a 50? I don't know.
No, they are not. They're all saying they're about 85 or over. Like, they rate themselves really highly on integrity. Yes, I think I'm like really high. So hardly anyone says 50, and no one's going below 50 and saying that.
Right.
Yeah. So, and yet, if 50 is the average, you would expect half the class to be below and half the class to be over this. But everybody thinks that they are extremely honest, which might be great. But then what the research shows that even at a young age, what we think we are and what you believe your values to be is quite different from how you actually behave. So a study of over 20,000 high school students, in that study, nearly 2/3 confessed to cheating on a test. Nearly 1/3 admitted to stealing something from a store in the past year. Now, I
Wow.
found that quite shocking.
Yeah.
And then the third one, which really broke my heart, was more than 80% said that they had lied to a parent about something significant. And these numbers are likely to be conservative because
Right.
the
They're not going to
students,
tell you. Maybe they're not telling you. Yeah.
And like the students even said, like they'd lied on at least one of the 4 questions.
Right. So chances are, okay.
Yeah. So it's not unique to high school students. What I've learned is that for so many of us, the distance between who we think we are and what we actually do is enormous.
Ooh.
And so
that's a big deal. That's really a big deal.
Yeah. Because
we got to clean that up.
we need to decrease that gap between who we are or who we aspire to be or who we think we are and how we actually behave. And this is why I have this Defiance Compass, which starts off with, who am I?
Yes.
And then the last question in that, there's 3 questions, 3 main questions. The last question in that Defiance Compass is, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? So what does a person like me, if you're thinking about yourself with these values, integrity, fairness, compassion, equality, whatever your values are, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? Then you can tap into your aspirational self, because if you are not speaking up when you see injustice or unfairness or other aspects that you really value, if the situation is going against your values and you don't act like the person, what does a person like me with these values do in a situation like that? Then it's going to change who you are.
Right.
So it leads back into, who am I? And so that first step of really clarifying what's important to us and why is very important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's such a great template to be thinking about. But I have to say, when I open the book, the first story you tell is the George Floyd story, which really speaks to exactly what you're doing in the research. And you talk about the other officers that were also holding down George Floyd. And what it makes me think about is that when things happen, are we able to ask ourselves the right questions, or what should our process be to get ourselves straight to our values so that we can make the right decision about the person that we are or that we want to be in every situation?
Right, exactly. And that's like a horrific situation that rookie cops found themselves in.
Yeah.
And here, this is why it becomes really important to prepare for those situations well before the moment of crisis. We can't, if we're surprised by something, that's always going to disable our defiance because we don't know what's going on. We freeze, we fail to put our values into action. So if we're not ready for that moment when it comes, it's really hard, even if you have these values, to act in alignment with them. Mm-hmm. So how can we do that? Well, some of the stories that follow that one of other police officers and how they've behaved is actually some of them were trained during the time that incident with George Floyd. They were trained during that time, and they had in their heads, I don't want to ever be in that type of situation. What am I going to do about it? And this is what we can do, because one of the ways to train for defiance is to make it a practice and have this action plan. And we can anticipate a lot of the situations in which defiance is required, because we've been in our workplace. We know this particular professor is going to say something inappropriate in the next meeting because he said it in pretty much every meeting that we've had. We know we're going to get asked to do certain things. And as one young police officer said to me, I knew this was going to be a tough job, and I knew I was going to get asked to do unethical things. I was going to be asked to look the other way. So he was prepared, and he had a mentor. So it's not just about intellectually knowing. So even in the police academy, where it says, if you see something wrong, to speak up, that's not enough. Intellectually, we know that, but we don't have the behavioral training. Our brains are still wired to comply. So we need to anticipate the most common situations where this will happen. They're often more predictable than we think. Then we need to visualize it. We kind of picture it first. And then we need to practice by scripting it out and role playing. So our bodies get used to that. Our ears get used to us saying defiant words, and our mouths get used to saying them, and our ears get used to hearing them. So we need to repeat that and practice it so we can be ready when the moment arrives. And there is a wonderful quote by a Greek poet that says, under duress, we don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. So that is why that's the only thing that's going to rewire our neural pathways so we can be defiant in the moment.
Are there other external factors that happen in that process in determining what we are going to comply with and not comply with, whether it's emotional or religious, or, what are the other factors that might come into play that get in the way of us staying true to our values?
Well, there's the external factors. There's many different types of social factors. So explained insinuation anxiety as one psychological process. There's also the fear of consequences. And of course, how socialized are you? Are you part of a particular work institution that has norms for compliance? Are you part of a religious affiliation that also has expected roles? So most of us are part of groups and affiliations and institutions where the workplace might be, for example, very expressive, or it might be non-expressive. So the environment definitely does have a big effect on us. And if we're in that type of situation, so you can look at Rosa Parks's famous no on the bus, that really had it changed a lot. It was very effective. But if you think about it, her no was preceded by hundreds of moments of compliance. She complied with segregation laws many times before until she did her famous no. And we often comply before our no. And that's okay. There's situations where we comply because the costs are too great, or we know it's not going to be effective. But some people, was it safe for Rosa Parks to defy on the bus that day? Not really.
Right.
I mean, yeah, she was receiving death threats and other things. And yet for her, she was really connected with her values. And on that day, she thought it would be effective. So we can't just ask, is it safe? Is it effective? Which are the two questions. We do need to consider those, of course, but we can also rationalize that it will never be safe or never be effective enough. So we need to ask, it's a very personal question to us. Is it safe enough for me? Will it be effective enough for me? Knowing that some people will take on great costs to stand up for what they believe in.
Yeah. I think that some people may listen and go, I have a boss, or I have someone at work that I don't agree with. They're not in line with my values. At the same time, you need the job. And if you question too much, so how do you handle that?
Yeah, so this comes along with, the Defiance calculus. So is it safe? And safety isn't not just physical safety, it's also financial safety, psychological safety. There's other things that we need to consider. And one of my students was telling me about when he got his first job, and his wife, they just had a child. He was very excited about it. And then he discovered corruption at the top levels. What was he going to do? Because he needed the job and he needed the financial security. So he did look the other way and hope that somebody else was going to speak up about this. So there are many costs for whistleblowers. Even though there's protections for whistleblowers, often then there's not enough protection for whistleblowers. So these become very individual decisions of, I can't defy in the way that I would like to right now. And so I'm going to consciously comply, which is very different from the type of compliance I was talking about that we're wired for, that we fall in. It's conscious compliance is when we have all 5 elements for consent. We have the capacity, we have the knowledge, the understanding, the freedom to say no, and we could authorize, but we think the costs are too great right now. So we're going to consciously comply not forever, but we're going to defer defiance to another time.
Oh, that's an interesting point, because I also don't want to beat myself up over complying when I think that it's the right thing to do.
Oh, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. So you want to consent, right?
Consent.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when this all works out perfectly, when you truly understand, when you go through that with your students, the who am I, and then what does this, when you go through the three questions, what does it look like? How should it look in the perfect world once we get to where we need to be with asking ourselves those questions?
Yeah. So who am I really taps into your values. So you need to know what your values are. And here we're very explicit by what we mean by values. So it's not goals. It's not moral convictions such as homosexuality is wrong or abortion is wrong, because those things can be divisive, and there's more than one answer. There's at least two, right? And so it's subjective. By values, they really come down to sort of some mostly single words, but very powerful words like integrity. There's no right or wrong. Integrity, benevolence, compassion, empathy. These are the values that I see time and time again. They seem almost universal. And they're very powerful if we can act in alignment with them day after day. It's what shapes your behavior on a daily basis. So who am I? And then the second question is, what type of situation is this? And that's where you're asking, is this safe? Is it effective? And you're really looking outwards at the environment and asking those questions. And then the last question, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? And then that is tapping into two things. That's your responsibility. So connecting with your values and who you're responsible for. Is it yourself? Is it your family? Is it your community? Who is it that you're responsible for in order to live in alignment with your values? And also having the ability, the skill set. Have you practiced for it? Because if you haven't, then it becomes intention, but not behavior. Yeah.
Right. I love those questions. So if people who are listening want to start today and say, how do I go about doing this? I've been rolling through life and I thought I was complying or consenting or defying, or I thought I was doing it all right, but really I haven't really thought much about this. And they would like to start implementing their values. Would you suggest those three begin there, or do you have a different starting point?
I think begin there. If you have time to, before a situation, is start there. Start with who I am. That's where it always, that's the beginning, is to really know who you are and what do you stand for.
Mm-hmm. And then from there?
Let me say two things, right, that I would love people to be able to do. Is first of all, have this mindset shift about what we think about defiance. So many people think of defiance as being really loud or bold or violent or angry and aggressive. Mm-hmm. They have a very negative connotation of it. Or they might think it's superhuman and out of reach, right? Something heroic like Rosa Parks. And I want to tell them that you don't have to be brave or a superhero. You don't have to have a strong personality or be larger than life. It's actually a practice, not a personality. So you can be compliant one day, defiant the next day. It isn't just for the brave or the extraordinary. It's available and it's necessary for all of us. So we can defy in our own unique way. There's no particular way that this is the right way to defy. We can find out, like some people will do it by protesting, by marching. Other people will do it by writing a letter. There's many different ways that you can defy with far less stress and angst that we usually have. And that really comes with asking ourselves, when we're in the situation, does this situation go against my values? And we're aiming for this values-driven defiance, not knee-jerk reactions. And when I said that we've misunderstood what it means to defy, this is why I came to this revelation. We actually need this new definition for defiance.
Right.
So whereas the old definition, well, the Oxford English Dictionary definition is to challenge the power of someone else boldly and openly. And I grew up in the UK, so I'm not one to normally disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary. But in this situation, I think it's way too narrow and it doesn't honor our agency. And my definition of defiance is simply to act in accordance with your true values when there is pressure to do otherwise. So it becomes this proactive, positive force in society. Because if you think about it, all our individual acts of compliance, of consent, of defiance, they create the society that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And it affects our lives, our workplaces, our communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm very passionate that we understand truly what it means to
Right.
defy.
Right. I love your definition. I hope the Oxford Dictionary takes it and
Yes, I hope so too.
Anything I didn't ask you about that you wanted to just mention before we wrap up?
Again, when like the situations that I spoke about that are life and death situations,
Mhm.
like the rookie cops, the nurses, the co-pilots, even when it's not life and death, we often keep silent when something is wrong, and we have that kind of tension. And we need to ask ourselves, if you think compliance is being good and defiance is being bad, that is sometimes bad to be good. Like, what do we actually sacrifice
Yeah.
by always trying to be so compliant? And we can really tap into that tension that we feel. Like, I often feel tension when there's a situation is asking me of something, there's expectations are going in against what I think is the right thing to do. And when we're in that situation, we often feel some type of tension. It might manifest in different ways for different people. Like for some people, it's their voice constricting or their throat constricting, their mouth getting dry, getting a headache. For me, I feel unease in my stomach, that something doesn't feel right here. And I differentiate that from a gut feel. This is about when there's two forces colliding, what you think is the right thing to do and what somebody else is expecting for you to do.
Yeah.
That's actually the first stage of defiance, because if you didn't feel tension, then you have given all your power away to someone else.
Right,
and so
right.
you would just go along with it. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
But the fact that you actually feel tension means that you have some agency, you have some
Mhm.
power. That is your strength. Just don't sort of try and sweep it away, that, ignore it like what other people, like we often do, right? That, it's not worth our doubt, it's not worth our anxiety. Actually examine it and acknowledge
Right.
it, and then work through the stages of defiance so we can get to that final act.
And do you have any research that shows when you do speak up in those situations of what the results are?
Right. So when we are able to defy, having just spoke about the tension there, when we are able to defy, the interesting thing is that tension actually melts away, it dissipates. If we try to ignore it, it often stays with us with this kind of niggling
Mm.
pain, and it sometimes grows. And so constantly complying in situations that go against our values, like constantly bowing your head to other people, if you're in that type of workplace, it can really damage you physically, psychologically, emotionally. It can lead to burnout,
Right.
chronic stress, inflammation, all of those things. So if you can defy, you're leading a more authentic, honest life, which is great, with less tension, which is fantastic. I do have research showing that if we know better and somebody tells us to do something, we predict that the other person, we can share the blame. The other person told me to. This like whole thing, I was just following orders, or somebody else told me to. But if you actually know better and then take something that goes against your better judgment, people experience what I call the kicking yourself syndrome. They actually feel more regret, more responsible, and more self-blame than if they had made the decision without somebody telling them to.
Mm.
So you can't wish away your responsibility. You might think you can. So it's best to embrace it and do what you think is the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much. Anything else that I didn't? We could go on and on. I mean,
We could go on.
Yeah, I love it. The book is Defy. You can continue to go on and read the book if someone's listening and wants to, and I'll have a link to the book in the show notes and all of that. But thank you so much for your time. This is such an important conversation, and it's not so nuanced. I think we do it every day. I mean, the crew that's in here, I was telling them who's coming and everything, and they go, "Yeah, I do that all the time. Why do I do that?" So it's just such an important subtlety in our everyday life. And I love how you laid it out and then also say it's a practice.
Yes.
It's a practice, just like
It's
everything
not a
else.
personality.
Yeah.
Yes. Even if you see yourself as being very compliant, you can learn the skill.
Yeah, you can learn the skill.
I
I
want to
love
make
that.
defiance accessible to everyone.
And it's not negative. In fact,
No,
it's a positive
thing.
Right.
It's a positive
So
thing.
we're going to start that today. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sah.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful conversation. So thank you for having me.